Hey everybody, it's Kneecap here, and in this video we actually have some Retribution Paladin changes and updates here. So as you can probably tell from the title or thumbnail, we got an AoE buff. So here we go, Retribution Paladin changes. Divine Storm damage increased by 8%, Wake of Ashes damage increased by 10%, and Consecration damage increased by 12%. These are all obviously AoE centered damage things. Wake of Ashes is our core move of our single target as well, and that's where most of the single target buff comes in. It's not very much single target, but obviously Consecration, Divine Storm, those are going to do a lot more in like a Mythic Plus, for example. Now, I did do some quick math to go over this and to talk about this, but it's also important to note before I even mention that this was like a Mythic Plus tuning pass. Like all the abilities that were touched were like AoE abilities for the most part. Other Warrior, I think, got some AoE buffs on some of their stuff as well. Some AoE nerfs as well. So this was like a Mythic Plus tuning pass. Seeing how specs were doing in Mythic Plus, seeing where their damage was, and nerfing or buffing it. And so this is largely a Mythic Plus thing. So if you are a raider, I know a lot of people who watch my rec content are more raiders. This doesn't affect us a lot, and I'll go over that real quick. So again, this is quick math. I did not run a million simulations or anything like this. This is me taking, some examples from Warcraft logs and divvying out the numbers, right? And just getting, a roundabout answer. Obviously, I think the sim will probably, especially with Consecration, and some people, if people are misplaying on their Wake of Ashes or Divine Storm, right, like not being close enough to enemies, the simulation's always going to assume you're hitting everything right every time, and that things are not being pulled out of your Consecration. So Warcraft logs is kind of more of a real life estimate of the math, whereas a simulation will be like, well, if everything goes perfect, this is what it is. So in single target, like a single target raid fight, this is about a 0.6% ish single target buff. So not even 1%, although maybe the sims will say it's like a 1% buff or so, like if everything's played perfectly. But it's somewhere, let's just say between 0.5 and 1% single target buff, somewhere in there. Again, so just the takeaway again, because I don't want to focus too much on my math here, is that it's a very, very, very small single target buff, right? So don't expect your single target DPS to shoot up or anything like that. Now, for a raid fight with cleave in it, such as Neltharion and Sark specifically, are what I looked at, right? So I specifically looked at a fight that had like ads that come out and you kill them, right? For this, it'll be around a 2% give or take buff. So a little bit better there as far as that goes. Now that makes a lot of sense. If you look at, now even I'm guilty of this. If you look at the overall performance of Ret and Raid, you'll see us at the very bottom. Now this is because on Assault of Zakeli, we're not the greatest, and on Experiments, we're not the greatest, and some of these fights like that kind of really weigh us down. And then like the single target fights were more middle of the pack, right? Magmarax, Rashok, were like middle of the pack, and we're pretty strong. And if you're a good player in your own personal raid group, you're probably doing pretty well, like on your damage meter on those fights. And so do we need a pure single target buff? For next patch, we do, yes. But do we need a pure single target buff right this second? Debatable, right? Because we are still middle of the pack. So I think that's fine. Although, again, this needs to be addressed. I've talked about it plenty. This needs to be addressed, in my opinion, before next patch. Either some rework to mastery or something that's going to give us a single target buff in the future, because it is something that's going to be needed, even if it's not currently needed. And then so those fights are kind of keeping us down. The fights where you're going to be wanting to AoE more. In Experiments, we're single targeting anyways because our 2-target cleave is so bad. I don't think this will change it, but maybe it will. Maybe you would Divine Storm now after these little buffs here. So again, on a fight like Sark or Neltharion, it's going to be like a 2% buff. That's not going to like bring us to the top of those. We're still like bottom third on those type of fights, and that's not going to really change that. It'll move us up closer to the middle of the pack, but not really change that too much. But yeah, it's a very non-raid centered buffs. Now for Mythic Plus, unfortunately, I wasn't even going to try to do any math for Mythic Plus because there's too many variables here. Fortified versus Tyrannical, this is a huge Fortified buff, but it's not as big as a Tyrannical buff, even though it's still a buff. You know, different dungeons have different numbers of bosses. A boss could be Tyrannical, or it could be Fortified, right? So there's different things like that are variables. And so overall, though, I could venture a guess that this is probably somewhere between a 5 10% is probably way too high, but it's probably somewhere around a 5 to 7% Mythic Plus buff, somewhere in there. I think I'm comfortable saying around 5-ish for Mythic Plus, and then up to 7 and maybe more on Fortified week, right? So this is it's a pretty solid Mythic Plus buff, right? For your overall damage, end of dungeon damage on Mythic Plus, it's a pretty solid buff. Obviously, Divine Storm is going to be a huge portion of your damage Mythic Plus, and if you just take that up by 8%, it's going to be a pretty good number right there, right? That could be a 3-4% buff on its own or something like that. 2, 3, 4, whatever. Wake of Ashes damage, again, 10% buff. Consecration, obviously more viable in Mythic Plus, typically, depending if it's Sanguine or whatever. All the mobs just sitting in it, whereas on Sark or Neltharion, the ads are dying before it even gets all the ticks of your Consecration in it or whatever. So there's a big difference there. So basically, we had a Mythic Plus tuning pass. This, if you're into Mythic Plus, this is actually really good news for you. It's a pretty decent buff. You're probably a little bit lackluster with your damage Mythic Plus, although the Mythic Pluses that I've done, I've been fine with, like recently, still, like, because I haven't done as many Mythic Plus lately. But the ones I have done, I've still performed pretty well. Especially if there's an Aug Evoker, because they actually do synergize decently with Rat. Not the best, but pretty decently. And so, I've done pretty well in those. But yeah, this is a pretty good Mythic Plus buff. Not much to say on raid buff there. Hopefully that'll be coming in the future. And of course, obviously, as I have been advocating for, maybe kind of like a rework or a buff to mastery would just kind of settle it on its own. And maybe we'll see that. They at least have not completely forgot about us. They did notice us on their Mythic Plus tuning pass. We must have been doing pretty low damage, though, for them to buff us, because not a lot got buffs. There wasn't a ton of buffs in here. There's a lot of nerfs. It was nerfs to the really powerful comp of Mythic Plus. So we must have been pretty underperforming on damage in Mythic Plus to have this happen. So yeah, so congrats if you're a Mythic Plus player. At least this helps. It's not going to change your life or anything like that, but this is obviously good things for you. And if you're a raid player, at least it is a buff. It's nothing to write home about, but it's something. So I'm not going to be too overhyped about it. I'm not going to sit here and say it's the greatest thing ever, because it is what it is. But yeah, we'll just keep hoping for the future mastery buffs that are surely going to come to Rat, and that'll make things a little bit better. So that's it for this one, guys. As always, do ask you please subscribe to the channel, because it helps me out a lot. And other than that, everybody have a good one.